So why don't we give Tom Bassford a great welcome.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you. So, I'm a Cubs fan. Yeah, and it's been 108 years. So there wasn't much chance of the Cubs being problematic to doing SAT talks in October. And since the other team that I care about hadn't been anywhere near the playoffs in 30 years, it just seemed fairly safe for me that we could do SAT talks in October. And wouldn't you know it, after 30 years, the Royals decide to do something. And so here we are up against SAT talks, up against the Royals. But I'd take that any day. Wouldn't it be cool to have a World Series with the Cubs and the Royals? I'm not going to talk about that. So, SAT Talks is built around an idea. It's called the big idea. And I remember when we were trying to shape this, it's a question, really. I was working with a church, and we were trying to kind of figure out what is the end goal that we're trying to get at when we keep talking about sustainability. And we wrestled with this statement, and we tried to get it down into something catchier. But the more we wrestled with it, the more every single word in that statement seemed like it needed to be there. And so for just a second, I want to unpack it with you and take you back to some of the stuff that we were dealing with at the time and why it continues to be what it is today and why it's really the foundation of what we're doing here with SAT Talks. SAT stands for Sustainability and Transformation. How do we get to the kind of transformative things that we want to do through our church missions in ways that lead to sustainable change? That's the it, but what did we mean by that? And so we started going through it. First thing was, should we put this in a statement or a question? And we had some interesting conversations about that, and my feeling was that we're not far enough along to put this into any kind of a statement. That I don't know anybody quite yet in the world of philanthropy or church missions that has it figured out, whatever it is that sustainability is. So doesn't it make more sense for us to ask the question that we're asking? The intuitive question, I would guess, that brings you here today is you care about things, you care about people, you care about your church, you care about the work that you're doing in missions, but you're asking yourself some iteration of that question back there. How can we do this in ways that lead to lasting change? So what if we tried to create a hybrid between a question and a statement, and that's what came out of this, and it continues to kind of fuel what we're trying to do through Missions 3.0, through SAT Talks and things like that. And the question is simply this: how can churches and other faith-based organizations pursue their missional goals? Now, it starts off right there because we're a group of church folk, and we're not talking about how can we change the face of philanthropy. The folks that have been wrestling with this have been wrestling with it because they're involved in their church missions. And they're saying, you know what, I don't want just the philanthropic organizations of the world to figure these things out. I would like my church to do it too, because we're going to continue to be a church that does mission stuff around the world. I love my church. I love to be a part of it. So we probably ought to identify that we are a group of churches and faith-based organizations trying to ask this question of our church mission. So that was important. We had to keep that in there so that whoever we talked to, they understood that we were talking about how to mobilize and move the church. And tomorrow I'll talk to you a little bit about why I think the church is the right person or the right organization for us to be talking about in this space. But how do we get the church and other faith-based organizations to pursue their missional goals in ways that lead to self-sustaining solutions? Self-sustaining solutions. What we meant by that is, how can we do things in such a way that at some point in time, those that we are doing these things for or to or with no longer need us. They can self-sustain it themselves. So it wasn't about us being able to continue to raise money year after year after year after year, and we're not even talking about how long or how much money it might take to get to self-sustaining. But if the end goal isn't for us to somehow, some way, through all of our energies and efforts, to get those that we are working with to a point where they no longer need us, are we really talking about sustainability? And for us, that had to be a part of it. That whatever we're doing has to have some sort of an end goal in mind that we get people to a place where they can self-sustain the charitable stuff that's happening in relationship to that partnership. Where needs are being met without relying on charitable resources, and where the person or community has the ability to provide the ongoing means and opportunities to achieve their full potential. And what I'll say to you in that whole sentence right there, we kept putting the word hope, where the charitable resources that we were bringing into the picture created hope for people. And the more we wrestled with that, and the more we struggled with the reality of, is that really what we're trying to do? Have we succeeded if all we do is keep people's hopes alive? And none of us in the room, as we wrestled with that, thought that we would be okay if we lived the rest of our lives in hope of something that was never attained. So is hope necessary? It's absolutely necessary. And the things that we do along the way are meant to help create hope within people that feel a sense of hopelessness. But if the church or philanthropy as a whole, if all we ever do is bolster the hope that people have, but we never do the kinds of things that create the possibilities for them to actually reach those things so they no longer need to live in hope, but in the reality of those things, if we can't do that, are we really creating sustainable sorts of things? So we've tried to kind of pull this statement down into smaller, more succinct, and we think that someday we probably will. But for the time being, every single word in there is important to us. Because part of what we're trying to do through SAT Talks and this whole big idea is, how can we get to something that is truly different? Because we live in a day and an age right now where we've been able to identify the problem for what it is. And so we have wonderful books like Toxic Charity. We have wonderful books like When Helping Hurts and those kinds of things. And what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is we've been able to articulate the problem. And I'm never in a group where those books come up and somebody hasn't read those books and everybody shakes their head yes, that is what we're trying to get at. We've got a problem. We've created dependencies in our country and around the world. And how do we change that? And so we've been talking about the problem. We've been able to articulate all of those kinds of things. And so it's as if the whole idea of sustainable development has become the new buzzword or the new fad within the church and faith-based organizations and philanthropy and governments and all those kinds of things. And we're taking that language and we have to ask ourselves, what are we really doing? Are we just kind of dressing up the old stuff that we were doing in new language? Is it the same stuff, just dressed in new language? And I would argue that much of it is. That much of it is just the same old stuff dressed up in a brand new language, but when you start to push into it and you start asking the questions, does this have the chance of leading to something that truly is self-sustaining, where the people in context can provide in an ongoing way for their own circumstances without the influx of charitable resources? Then is it really sustainable? So what we've said is we believe that the church, we believe that faith-based organizations could play a part in redefining the way that this whole thing happens. That we have historically as a church been incredibly good at providing relief and betterment. And like so many other organizations that do charitable and philanthropic kinds of stuff, we haven't been so good at what we would call development. So what if we began to push into that? And what if we had the courage to call things what they are? What if we had the courage to say it's a learning curve? What if we had the courage to say this looked like it had the chance to be something sustainable? It looked like it could be something in the development area, but it really didn't happen. Would we then have the courage to call it what it is and say maybe we need to try another approach? And so you're going to hear from some practitioners here over the next couple of days that we've discovered that are doing things around locally and around the world that are really pushing into this space. And they're taking the things that they're doing and they're asking some of the hard questions that we're talking about here tonight. They're not taking the old stuff that we've been doing and just dressing it up in new language. It's not relief and betterment disguised as development. And we've asked these speakers to talk to you honestly about the things that they're learning, about the things that they're still testing in their theories of change, so that somehow we can learn from where they're at and we don't start using anecdotal evidence to prop up the things that we're doing that may not actually be leading to the self-sustaining kinds of things. It's not a bandwagon. We're not trying to create a bandwagon where a whole bunch of folks can jump on. We're trying to create a learning curve and living in the tension of what it means to experiment along these lines. And so as a part of that whole process, what I've discovered over the last 10 years is as we've gotten more comfortable admitting that there are these things that aren't quite working, people are beginning to say to me, well, what are you talking about? I get it. There's a problem. We get it already. What can we do about that? And so they're begging for those things out there. Show me what the it is. What is it? Can you show me some example of what you're talking about? And I've wrestled with that over the last 10 years, and part of my work has been to try to get close to people that are out there on the front end of this learning curve so that we could begin to point to the it that we're talking about. What is sustainable transformation? Because until the broader community of the church can begin to see what the it is, it just remains this theoretical idea, this point of frustration. But as in any paradigm shift, it usually takes a few people on the front end to work hard at something and to pay the dumb tax, if you will, to do the trial and error over time to get to the point where eventually you can start to point to some of the its. And that's what Sat Talks is about. You're going to get to hear from some people, especially tomorrow. And this is our attempt to say to you, that's it. And I just want to go down the list of some folks that we've invited here and why they're here. We've invited Michael Miller, and he's going to come up in just a minute and speak to you from Poverty Cure. You know, we've invited, this group is doing some of the best stuff I've seen anywhere around the narrative about the videos and the pictures and the movies of what's happening in places around the world. They're creating a story that you can point at and you go, oh my goodness. So everybody that came, you should have gotten a set of the DVD series that make incredible Sunday school and small group studies, a 6-week course in which you can look and see very clearly some of the things that they're talking about. And you can see some examples of people that are trying to do sustainable missions in various parts of the world. We've also invited Desiree Moniz. You're going to hear Desiree from Avenue of Life. And what I like so much about Desiree and the work that she's done is she gets the continuum of relief, betterment, and development. And the work that she does right here in the Kansas City area is some of the best relief and betterment that I've seen anybody do anywhere. But she has the wherewithal to connect it to a larger continuum that gets to community development. And some of the stuff that she's doing with a mattress recycling plant over in KCMO, but then also working with organizations like the Co-op here in town that's specifically focused on development types of things around economic development, mixed income housing, education, and those sorts of things. But it's important for the church. We're going to have to continue to create on-ramps for people to do the good they want to do in their churches. And a lot of that's going to be around the areas of relief and betterment. And what Desiree and Avenue of Life are demonstrating is that you can take those kinds of things and you can put them into a larger continuum so that the relief and betterment that you do doesn't lead to dependency, but leads to the kind of development outcomes that we're looking for. We've also got a not-for-profit here with Water 4. You're going to get to hear about how an Oklahoma faith-based not-for-profit group is building capacity in folks around the world. They're helping create clean water, which is a huge health issue, but they're also using that whole thing as a way to develop businesses so that in providing for the needs of those people within a community, you're also giving them the wherewithal to start businesses. You're going to hear from a church. You're going to hear from Huntsville, Alabama, because one of the things that has to be at the table are churches. We're about moving the church in this way. So how do we get churches involved? And you need to hear from some practitioners that are trying to take the stuff that we're learning here, and they're trying to make it happen inside of the local church. And that is a complex, complicated thing, because most churches are focused primarily on a positive volunteer experience. So how does somebody that's leading the missional work within a church who may be hired to provide those positive volunteer experiences for lots of volunteers who don't understand the complexity of what we're talking about, that's what they get paid for. Well, how do they lead that church into a place where they're not doing helping that hurts? And you'll hear from somebody that's struggling in the midst of that, because until we can push it to that level, we've really not mobilized the church to be a part of this bigger solution that we're talking about. I'm excited. We're also going to have Soledad Gompf with us from Peru. She's in Washington, D.C. right now, but born in Peru. And Soledad works for an organization called Finca. And it's one of the largest microfinance companies or institutions in the world. But we didn't have her come primarily to talk about microfinance. We had her come because what Finca is doing right now around social impact metrics is way out in front of what almost anybody is doing. So if we're going to get to sustainable solutions, we've got to answer the questions, how will we measure success? Are we just going to continue to measure success based on the outputs, the things that we're doing, the number of people that we send, the number of loans that we put into the pipeline? Or are we going to start looking at what they call social impact metrics? What is the impact, the long-term impact of the things that we're doing with microfinance and other things? Because one of the things that we need to do within church work as well as philanthropy as a whole is we've got to figure out what to measure and how to measure it. We can't keep saying, that's just hard, it's just too hard. But you can't measure those kinds of things the same way you can the bottom line of a business. So it's not that we can just simply take what we've learned in the marketplace and take it over into the context of poverty and say, okay, we're going to apply these principles, these spreadsheets, these kinds of things. It doesn't work that way. But surely there is some answer to what social impact metrics or the kinds of things that we could measure that would show that we're moving the needle and actually helping to create the context or the kinds of things that could help people out of poverty. We've also invited a missions practitioner here that helped us actually kind of craft what we're now calling Missions 3.0 and what it looked like and what it's been, how it met the needs of their church in moving their people in a whole different direction. And then we've asked a businessman because if the church is going to be involved in this, it's going to take us making a space. I'm ordained pastor, and I don't have the business expertise that many of the people in my church did and many of you in this room have. And traditionally, the church has not created the space for marketplace people to be able to come in and do the kinds of things that they do through their church missions work. So we've asked a marketplace person to come and share with you a little bit about their journey in this whole idea of Missions 3.0, of how we're kind of the frustrations and what they're learning in the process and what it's like to kind of create a space for yourself in here. And then we've asked somebody that's deeply involved with the missional living, disciple-making movements to come and talk, because our churches are about making disciples, but oftentimes what's happening in our churches is that there's this clash between the things that are required for us to do disciple making in the church, which is primarily about us in this room, and what do we do to help you grow more deeply in your faith. And believe it or not, sometimes the things that we put out there, mission pastors, that being the case, that we put out there to help you grow in your faith in terms of missions actually represents the kinds of things that actually hurt the people that we're trying to help long term. So we're living in that tension that a positive volunteer experience for many of us that in this room may in fact be a negative experience for the people that we're trying to help towards self-sustaining solutions. So how do we deal with that? And we've got a speaker that's going to talk a little bit about that in the process as well. The other thing that we're trying to do in this whole thing is we're trying to create a tribe. Seth Godin in his book Tribes writes that a tribe is a group of people connected to one another and connected to an idea. For millions of years, human beings have been part of one tribe or another. A group needs only two things to be a tribe. They need a shared interest and a way to communicate. Those of us here today, we share an interest in creating sustainable solutions. And SAT Talks is about creating that tribe. Missions 3.0 is about finding ways that we can start to talk together, develop a new language, and begin to refer to the same thing, meaning the same thing when we do. So I had the opportunity about 10 years ago, for just a short period of time, to work with Bob Buford and the Leadership Network as I was starting Significant Matters. And there were a number of wonderful things that happened in that process. But one of the things that was just a real pivotal moment for me was in a conversation that was happening. Bob was talking to us about the early days of Peter Drucker's mentoring him. And if you know Bob Buford's story, you know that he went through a tragedy in his life, lost a son in a car accident. He had a very large media empire down in the Texas area, and he sold it. He came to a point and said, what am I doing with my life? And he sold his empire. And Peter Drucker's was a mentor of his, and Peter at that time had given the last 20-some years of his life to the not-for-profit sector and was saying that the future of our country lies in the not-for-profit sector. And so he encouraged Bob to focus on the not-for-profit sector in this next season of his life. And Bob is a man of faith, deep faith, and so not just any kind of philanthropy was going to work for Bob, so he wanted to do something out of his evangelical faith. And so what was birthed out of that is, for those of us in church leadership, we've all heard of the Leadership Network. And that grew out of Bob Buford's interest in what he was going to do moving forward in the next part of his life. From there, he looked for an analogy to talk about what was going on in his life, and he said, this feels a little bit like halftime. And so at halftime, you go in, you assess what you're doing, and you make some adjustments, and you go out and you play the second half. And so he wrote a book called Halftime that probably many of you have read in the process. But here's another thing that Peter said to Bob as he got started. He said, Bob, whatever you do, he said, focus on the 2.5. So if you're familiar with the bell curve, the diffusion of innovation, you know that there's the 2.5 innovators, and then there's the 13.5 early adopters, 34% early majority, 34% late majority, and then the rest are called laggards. What a horrible name. I just don't ever want to be known as a laggard. But what he was saying, he said, Drucker said to him, Bob, focus on the 2.5 because the distance between the front of the bell curve and the middle of the bell curve is a constant. And I remember as I heard that thinking, oh my goodness. Because in the early days, I was beating my head against the wall trying to go to the middle of the bell curve in churches, trying to get them to think differently about the way that we do church missions. And all I would get was, yeah, but no, that's not going to work. Or no, the scriptures say you'll always have the poor with you, and all of those kinds of things. And the harder I tried, the more difficult it got. And in that moment, when I heard him say that, I thought, there's wisdom in that. That the real goal that I should be working on right now is the 2.5. And so it started me on a journey to begin to look for people who are already asking these kinds of questions. Who is it out there that's already saying, there's got to be a better way for us to do good? There's got to be a way for us to do good in such a way that it retains human dignity, that it does it differently so that we don't have to keep pouring money into these things, so that there is reciprocity in the kinds of things that we're doing. And in that simple little statement, it freed me up to begin to look for people like yourselves. I mean, if you look at this room, there's not a ton of people here today. I think there's more people out there asking these kinds of questions than what you see right here. But in any movement, the early stages of that are a few people who get it, who can come together and can begin to talk together and not have to constantly push back at those who are saying, no, it's okay the way that it is, or we're already doing that. And so one of the things that we did even today was we had a pre-conference in which some of the folks that had been working on this and some of our speakers and those folks got together just so we could talk. And it was a great time getting together. It was a great time of us talking through some of the things that we're wrestling with, because eventually what we want to do is we want to create this tribe to be a bigger place. And the bigger that this gets, the more conversations that we have, the more we will begin to discover some of the things that are out there that will only be discovered as people get together and begin talking. People that are solving for these things are beginning to find answers, because guess what? Nobody has this figured out. You're not going to hear from a single expert up here. There's nobody that knows how to do this. There's just a bunch of us with a humble confidence that we're doing some things right, and that we're on the right path, and that we're asking some of the right questions. But what we'd like to do is to continue to work together in such a way that this group gets bigger and bigger, and so that together we can begin to innovate the things that need to happen along the way. So here's what's happening. As I'm doing more and more work with churches, I'm having the same response from just about everybody. We'll get in and we'll do some early stuff with a group of people, and we'll start talking about the evidence that our helping is hurting and those kinds of things. And it happens in virtually every group. And after the first session or so, people start to kind of get down, and down. And I'm noticing that there's three primary feelings that people have when they start wrestling in this area. And they tend to feel either overwhelmed, guilty, or there's usually a few people that feel determined. And that what I'm finding is most people feel somewhere between overwhelmed and guilty. And so they start saying to themselves, oh my goodness, this is too big. How are we ever going to do it? Let's just go back to the simple kinds of stuff. This is crazy. Or they start feeling guilty and they're saying things like, we've done it all wrong. It's all wrong. All I've done is hurt people over time. And why are we? And then you kind of get this paralysis. Man, if everything I ever thought that I was doing was causing harm, why try to do anything good? And all of a sudden we're in that crazy space right there. And there's a few people who go, oh, this sounds like a great challenge. I know that we can do it. Come on, let's go get them. There's just a few of those. Here's what I'd like to suggest. I'd like to suggest that if you're in the overwhelmed or the guilty, that you're not imagining well enough. I like what Lewis said. He said, the problem isn't that we imagine too little, but that we don't imagine well enough. You see, I think we get to come to these sort of things and we get to ask ourselves the what if question. What if the only way to get to this conversation is to go through what we've gone through as a human race? What if we are exactly where we should be in the story? What if, in fact, God is looking down from heaven and he's saying to his church right now, not I'm disgusted with you. You ought to feel guilty for all the things you do. What if he's saying, well done, my good and faithful servants? What if he's saying, I brought you just to this place because now you're in a place where you can take your problem-solving skills and begin to solve some of these problems in a different way? I choose to think that's what God is thinking right now. That he's not wanting us to feel overwhelmed or guilty. That he's wanting us to understand that he's put before us an opportunity. And that if we will collectively work together, the church could be a force in making the kinds of differences in poverty that would change the very face of poverty. One of the groups that we invited to come was Michael Miller with Poverty Cure. How many of you were at the Poverty Inc. showing just about a week or so ago? So that'll give you a little bit of an idea. One of the things I like about that, and I'm going to invite Michael up in just a minute, one of the things I so like about what Poverty Cure is doing is they're giving us a language and they're giving us some stories. And the way in which they define poverty as being excluded from networks of productivity and exchange, and then going on to say that it's not about poverty alleviation, it's about human flourishing. And we've asked Michael to come and talk to us a little bit about his experience with Poverty Inc. and then just share with us some of the stuff that they're learning out there. But I don't want you to miss those two concepts because they come from a lot of deep thought and a ton of experience around the world in saying that the way we talk about this stuff matters. That if we're trying to alleviate poverty, we're probably never going to get there because it's really not our place to alleviate poverty. But what if our job is to create the conditions by which humans can flourish? And what if a large part of that is figuring out how to create the networks of productivity and exchange?